Welcome to Humble Beginnings, a podcast where we uncover the unconventional, more relatable paths to success. In this show, we'll share the stories before the C-suites, board memberships, and appointments, the stories of various upbringings, first jobs, career pivots, educational uncertainties, and more. This is the place to hear about their lives from the GovCon executives themselves. We hope you enjoy. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Humble Beginnings. I'm your host, Amanda Ziede, and joining me today is Richard Sawchak, CEO of Systems Planning and Analysis. Thank you so much for being here today, Rich.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Of course. So, Rich, I'd love to start by asking if our guests can talk a bit about their background and upbringing. So tell us a bit about growing up in Scranton, Pennsylvania.
Oh, sure. So I was born and raised in Scranton, Pennsylvania. Grew up in the west side of town to my two parents there. Grew up in a pretty, typical household. I have three sisters and one brother, and grew up, in some ways, though, a little bit like an only child because I'm aged differently than my sisters and brothers. They're a bit older than I am, so I was quite a few years younger later in my parents' lives when they had me, and so really fun to get to grow up with that in the house, out of the house. But went to Catholic school and for middle school and Jesuit for high school, and then left Scranton to go to college. But while I was there growing up, my wife and I met in 8th grade and started dating in 10th grade, and then got engaged while we were in college. So one of those stories of a son born to parents who had met and married just after high school, and then I found my wife when I was in high school as well.
Wow, that's awesome. I didn't know that. So what kind of things were you into growing up? Did you have any jobs as a kid, any extracurriculars, any hobbies?
I did. I had a few jobs. I think like a lot of young men and women in Scranton, I started off as a paperboy when I was 11 or 12 and delivered the newspaper for several years up until I turned a teenager. I actually got my first, I'll say, real job at a company where I had to show up and do something. I worked for Little Caesars, and I made pizzas. It's kind of funny. I'm not too ashamed to say I actually got let go from Little Caesars. I guess I ate too much cheese versus making enough pizzas, and so they decided I wasn't quite the best worker. Fortunately, my dad, who graduated high school and started into commercial banking right out of high school, at that point in my life and his, he had risen up the ranks from literally being a teller and working in the mailroom up to being the president of the bank in our local area. And it was a relatively small bank. It wasn't, by any means a JP Morgan or a PNC bank or something like that, but a nice community bank that was in the area. And so he hired me when I was in high school to work at the bank and take care of a few things administratively for the bank on a daily basis. So I would go there after school and on the weekends and work for the bank. And so I did that for the remainder of high school and up and through some parts of college until I got my other internships and more full-time work after college.
Awesome. We have a lot of executives who started as paperboys and pizza delivery or pizza making people. So I think that's a really funny common thread, actually. But tell me a bit more about your family. I understand your grandparents immigrated from Ukraine. And as you mentioned, your father had his own humble beginning. So tell us a bit about how his story has impacted you and perhaps even your grandparents.
Yeah, so on my dad's side, my dad was 100% Ukrainian. His parents both immigrated over at different time periods with their families, settled in that general Scranton, Pennsylvania area. They actually settled in a little town called Plymouth. And then my dad was born and raised in Scranton, actually, as his father got married and settled on his own. So my grandfather of Ukrainian descent worked on the railroad. So he was one of those maybe typical people who immigrated in and took a job that had a lot of labor with it. It was a hard job. He wound up being a foreman on the railroad, but was one of those working foremen who, could still was pretty strong into his old age. And so he kind of looked at my dad, who was his namesake. My dad's a junior. My grandfather's name was Peter Sawchak. My dad's name was Peter Sawchak Jr. And he told his son to take a different path, to make sure he used his brain instead of his brawn to get through life. And so I guess my dad took that seriously. Unfortunately, he still is probably to this day one of the smartest people I had ever known. My dad graduated high school at 16, and like I said, he started in the local commercial bank working in the mailroom and as a teller, and worked his way up into the loan office and became the head loan officer years later. So just somebody who really took to heart that work ethic and trying to find his own place in the community, and was very, very loyal. I remember working at the bank, all those years later when my dad was at the later stages of his career, and people would come in from their local businesses to either make a deposit or make a withdrawal or to get ready for their payroll for their business. And they would be at the bank, and it seemed like everybody in the community knew my dad, just because he had either given them a car loan or a house loan or a business loan over the years. And he was very hands-on. So he would come out of his office, even at that point, and say hello to the local business people, the men and women who would come in, and engage with them on a very one-on-one and personal basis. And I remember his perspective of bringing in a client to the bank or giving a loan out was about the analysis. He would run the numbers and do the work that the bank needed to do from a fiduciary responsibility perspective. But at the end of the day, in a community banking environment back then, it was about trust. You really looked at a person, you knew who they were, where they were from, what they wanted to try to accomplish, and you put some faith and trust in that person the same way they put it into you at the bank. And that was really impactful. So it just something that those perspectives I grew up with. My mom's side of the family was not Ukrainian. Her parents had parents that immigrated over, one from the England area and the other one from Italy. And so on my mom's side, English and Italian, my dad, Ukrainian. So funny enough, back in Scranton, they were from different parts of town. So it was pretty fun to see them get together in high school and then ultimately get married. And they were married before they passed away several years ago. They were married for nearly 60 years. My wife and I, who are now married almost 28 years, and together almost 35, look on that fondly, and sort of look to their life starting young and ending up together when they were, in their senior years. So really, really fascinating, but very, I'd say, that small town orientation in terms of the upbringing and the memories we have and the lifestyle we lived with.
Yeah, absolutely. That's beautiful. And it's crazy how sometimes you can run similar parallel lives to those that you were so inspired by and impacted by in your life. So speaking of that, I understand your father is one of your mentors. So were there any specific guidance or advice that he shared with you at a young age that's kind of stayed with you throughout your life?
Yeah, there's so many things. I think at the end of the day, it really boiled down to my dad's overall lifestyle that I looked up to. He put a lot of attention on me. I was the youngest of 5 children, the first one in our family, direct family to go to college. And so, things that my dad would portray would be, the real ethics and morality of the things we believed in, that belief system really culminating in everything you thought and did in life. I remember my dad saying, my family calls me Ricky. So I go by Rich in the professional world. But so, he said, Ricky, you can choose which college you go to. You don't get to choose whether you go to college. And so there were some things that my dad portrayed in terms of that work ethic and the way he approached situations and the trust and faith he put in people. And, the fact that before we would go to bed every night, he'd read me a story and we'd go through math problems. And maybe that's why I went through, so many years as a CFO before I became a CEO. Because that was what I grew up with. And I was used to being at the bank and in the financial world. And so it's all of those things that just over time you see a person who really does what they say and says what they do. And my dad was one of those people.
That's awesome. So college was always on the radar for you then? You didn't have a choice.
No choice, just where. Yeah.
So what drew you to studying finance at Boston College? Was it those years of math before bed?
I guess so. It's funny. I got into, so I went to Boston College because my father at the bank, his legal counsel had graduated from Boston College Law. So he was a double eagle from BC Law. And I kind of looked up to the lawyer at the bank and I thought, wow, he's had a great career. He's well-spoken. He's got a nice car. He seems to have some money. I thought, well, those are all great attributes. That college must prepare people very well for a life of success. And so it was, as a young kid from Scranton, you didn't know, at least I didn't know too much about what was really outside of Scranton. I hadn't traveled yet much. I didn't have a wide, expansive view of the world. And so I looked up to that individual. And since my dad had never gone to college, that was the next closest thing. And so I actually only got into Boston College. It was one of two schools I applied to. I got into BC, so I went to BC. And I look back so fondly on those memories. You know, I was there from 1992 to 1996. And my wife, then my girlfriend and then fiance went as well. She's also a Boston College graduate. So we went together for the same years. And so it was just a great school to go to. We, having come from a Jesuit high school and BC being a Jesuit college, we also, and I saw the value of that. I liked their educational style. It really drove home a lot. I actually thought I was going to be a lawyer. So I initially was studying economics and theory, thinking that would lead me well to taking the LSATs and getting into grad school for law. And then I realized that I just didn't really latch onto that idea. It wasn't what I enjoyed studying. And I switched over to being a finance major. And that was because I guess maybe my upbringing did come back around and kind of open my eyes to the fact that maybe that's what I was raised to be. And so went through finance, and little known secret is I also have a degree in theology. So I took from my upbringing in some of the Catholic and then Protestant theology that I grew up with, of a real love of getting into the philosophy of things and understanding that background and doing the writing and the theses and trying to really kind of put pen to paper on that. And so I studied both finance and theology in college. So I guess maybe I was a more ethical CFO because of it, but it worked out quite well. And it was really fun at BC to study from some of the best and brightest in the country in those areas.
Yeah, that's a really interesting pairing. But when you put it that way, as an ethical CFO, it makes sense. We should be pairing some of these, more human or theoretical majors with some more of the technical ones going forward, right? That would be a great process. Well, I have some reflective questions for you later on, but I do want to talk more about your education and career. So after graduation, I understand that you joined Lucent Technologies to do M&A analysis. How did you land this job after college, and what was your experience there?
So when I was in college, I was a sophomore in college. I met another Boston College graduate who was about 6 years ahead of me. So he had been out of college for a few years when we first met, and he had joined AT&T out of school and was thriving there in a number of different jobs, very much focused on investor relations and some other areas for AT&T as a public company. So he had come back to the school to recruit additional individuals, and we struck up a friendship through those recruiting processes. And so I looked at interning there, and I kept in touch with him. And ultimately, just as I was getting ready to graduate from college, Lucent Technologies spun out of AT&T back in 1996 when they separated the services business from the equipment business. And so I actually applied to AT&T for a job. And when I got accepted into AT&T, by the time I showed up, they had told me that I was no longer going to be an AT&T employee. I was going to go to the new company called Lucent that was just named back in 96. Fortunately, my friend from BC, who helped recruit me into the company, also chose to go to Lucent. So we were still with each other post-college. And then, as a little tangent, my wife joined Lucent as well. So it was kind of interesting. We moved down to northern Jersey. We were married, and we were both working for the same company. So just really funny how my wife and I, we rarely separate from each other. But I joined Lucent and got in there because of my finance background and the leadership development program I had joined as part of my employment. My first rotation in the company was in their corporate development merger and acquisition group. And so I spent a year helping Lucent buy companies, occasionally sell a piece of the business, do some joint ventures and some product analysis from that position in that group, and was very, very fortunate to see a lot of different things over that first time. And that led me to be able to find my path through my next 3 or 4 positions within Lucent before I left a few years later.
Awesome. And I don't want to discredit Little Caesars, but was there something particular that this first professional, real job after college taught you?
It's funny. I will go back to that for a second. I said that I was sort of asked to leave Little Caesars, and that's true. I also interned on Wall Street before I graduated. So I didn't intern at Lucent or AT&T while I was in school. I went directly there as my first full-time job out of college. But during my internship, I also hadn't sort of got myself yet. I had a great work ethic when it came to studying at school. But for whatever reason, these new experiences, Little Caesars, and then ultimately being on Wall Street, I just got distracted by being in New York City and had a lot of fun that summer. But that company as well sort of said, Rich, you're really not cut out to be here. And so kind of like going from high school to college where I really buckled down and I graduated summa cum laude from Boston College, despite being dead in the middle of my class in high school. So I really had a turnaround. Those same two life lessons for me, Little Caesars and Wall Street, taught me that I really needed to do something different when I took my first job. And so Lucent was that place that I really cut my teeth in understanding what my work ethic was going to be, how I was going to apply the same study habits I learned in college to how I was going to work. And really fortunate to have caught on to that trend early in my career. And I think it's what helped me succeed in a lot of ways is that first time. One of the things that I sort of made part of my mantra at Lucent early in those days, especially in the M&A group, was never say no. If the vice president came down the hall and there were a stable of analysts that worked in the group, I was one of them. When they had the next deal that was ready to be worked on and he came down and said, who wants it? I raised my hand fast and every time. And in fact, compared to the rest of the analyst group, I worked on and completed 12 transactions in the first year that I was in that group.
Wow.
No one analyst in the group had more than one transaction for that year. And so now I worked about 110 hours a week, but I had a very productive year and I learned a ton and I got a ton of experience that really did and has still to this day helped me in my career.
Wow. Yeah, that is quite the work ethic. But if I understand, you also switched and kind of took a pivot after Lucent Technologies as well to a small startup company. So tell us about why you made this move and what that transition was like for you.
Yeah, Lucent at the time I worked there, as we spun off from AT&T, was about 160,000 employees. It was about $25 billion in revenue per year before it broke up into multiple companies down the road. I left there because I realized one day that I couldn't see the impact I was having every day, at least not at the corporate level. And I was in some very high visibility corporate positions that gave me access to really being able to make change inside of Lucent. And even with that access and ability, you just kind of get trapped inside of a large organization where you don't see your work product driving something on a regular basis. And so I made a decision to go to a startup company that was roughly 150 people and about $20 million in revenue. So it was literally about 1,000th of the size of Lucent. And I really just found that if I applied that same work ethic of always say yes and get the job done, that I could see the impact I had materially on the business every day that I was there. I was engaging with the founder of the company who was the CEO. I was engaging with the new CFO of the business who had come in from other large companies, including General Electric. And it was just fascinating to be able to be tutored and mentored by them and at the same time be able to contribute to adding value to the business every day. It was just so much more fun. And ultimately, secondly, it gave me exposure to a world of venture capital backing at the same time that we used that to take the company public down the road. So I got to see corporate structures that I had only seen from the outside while I was working at Lucent. Now I was on the inside, literally seeing how they impacted the business every day. That had a huge impact on the next 25 years of my career because I've almost since that day stayed in those types of environments, either venture backed or private equity backed, in almost every job I took after that little company called Multilink Technology.
Yeah, let's get into those 25 years. Of course, we don't have time to go through everything, but as best as you can, take us through the progression of your career to follow and what ultimately led you to CEO of SBA.
Yeah. So, I started off in Lucent, had 4 years of jobs that took me everything from corporate financial planning and FP&A into some factory accounting through mergers and acquisitions, worked with the treasury team for a while and worked with investor relations, went to the startup company and was their first director of finance and director of investor relations. Worked on the company's S1 filing and helped take them public, did their investor calls for the quarters that we were there, and then ultimately helped sell the business when we were looking to be acquired to bulk up and be part of a larger organization. From then, I left and started to join a group or a set of private equity-backed companies over the next several years that led to me taking on my first CFO role in 2005. So I was about 9 years out of college, and there was a small-ish company that was in government contracting, but technically publicly traded, looking to get some private investment, and they needed a new CFO that could help them navigate these waters of some federal business, some commercial business, some services business, some software business in a public environment, but really needing new funding to get their job done from a strategic perspective. And they took a chance hiring a young individual who had never been a CFO before, but had been in large and small companies and seen a lot of different areas. And so they brought me in 2005. And from 2005 until 2011, my partners and I inside that company transformed that business and ultimately sold the business to CACI in 2011. So I really cut my teeth as a CFO in a smaller business that I didn't know the industry for because I had never been in government contracting. So I didn't know anything about the federal acquisition regulations or how the government buys from different companies or how companies try to sell into the government. And I didn't know about this market. And my wife and I had just moved to Maryland. And so we were new to the state as well. We'd only been here for 2 years when I took that opportunity. So it was really foundational for me. But it did set me up to be known as a successful CFO at that smaller level and allowed me to take successive positions as a CFO 3 more times at larger and larger businesses to add value in a more significant way. And in every case after that, those businesses were private equity-based businesses. So they were portfolio companies of different private equity firms. Metalmark Capital, Arlington Capital Partners, then the Carlyle Group as one of their portfolio companies, and then now back to being a CEO at an Arlington Capital-backed portfolio company called Systems Planning and Analysis. So I rejoined the Arlington Capital family when I took on this role at SPA, which started off as a board of director role and led to me being the CEO when our prior CEO, my predecessor, retired a year ago. So he's living his best life now and traveling with his wife and seeing his family and just having a great time. And he still sits on our board and helps me out and gives counsel to me. But it's nice to see him being able to focus on himself, and it made the opportunity for me to be able to step in from the board and take over on a full-time basis in my first CEO job, which I do credit Arlington Capital for being that type of private equity firm that keeps track of those executives that have done well by them and remembers them to keep them in the portfolio so that they're reusing that expertise that understands them and they understand the individual, and you can move further faster in those subsequent events. So it's been really, really fun. But, as a CFO, I guess the last thing that sort of positioned me for that CEO job now is over time as a CFO, because I had done the job multiple times, every successive time that I became a CFO, not only was it a larger, more diversified platform company, but I also was able to take on more things than the first time you're a CFO when you really have to focus in on finance and accounting. By the time I did my 3rd or 4th CFO position, I was able to also be the person who managed the IT infrastructure and security and contracts and pricing and HR and recruiting and facilities and legal and all those other things that help the business operate and run in a more holistic way. It wasn't as big a step because of that background and having influenced operations and business development and technology development in those companies, even indirectly, for me to make the leap to then lead the overall organization as a CEO, because I had been operating more like a COO at the time in my later stage CFO jobs.
And I mean, you joined the C-suite pretty young. Did you have to overcome any imposter syndrome or, I don't know, were you nervous at all to take a leadership position like that at such a young age?
I think I've been an imposter my entire career and still am to this day. But so far, people keep inviting me back and haven't sent me home. So the Little Caesars days are gone now. But yeah, no, I think every good executive should have a little bit of self-doubt. You show confidence to your team, but I think you have to be reflective and look in the mirror and keep yourself sharp by wondering if you really have everything you need to do the job. It's what keeps you learning and keeps you looking for more information and more counsel and more mentorship and more guidance. And I do credit a bit of that, maybe having gotten there a bit younger than some others sometimes, that it's allowed me to be more reflective, force me to think about what I need to expand on and where my gaps are and what I need to fill and do better at to keep me moving forward. But I think you also have to have a bit of that reasonable arrogance. Otherwise, you're never willing to take the next job. So you've got to know when it's time to move up and on, but you've also got to realize that when you do that, you're taking a risk, and you've got to be ready to figure that out as you go.
So, Rich, tell us about the charitable work that you do for the University of Valley Forge, which I understand was previously called the Valley Forge Christian College. But tell us a bit about the work that you do there and how you got involved with this.
There's a number of things that my wife and I and then I do personally from a charitable perspective, but they all seem to revolve around heart health and cancer research, and then higher education and mentorship. And so this is one of those things for me, the passions for me that's in the higher education area. UVF is a small regional Christian university that primarily actually creates pastors and missionaries. They've expanded as a university where they also have digital media majors and finance and accounting majors and other business areas beyond that, those other vocations. But they started as a school 85 years ago that was focused on building leaders for that denomination that they're affiliated with. And so when I joined the board not because I went to the school. In fact, I used to make fun of the school because it was such a little college and it had such a specific focus. And, it wasn't what people that like me who came out of Boston College were going to make a lot of money or have big careers. It was people who were going to maybe make the world a bit better place from their perspective. And so I joined the board because I looked around in my life and some of those influences in my life that weren't my dad or weren't the other business mentors that I had in my life. Some of the mentors that I had that helped me be the person that I am had been graduates of that school when I was younger. And I realized that I needed to give back to the place that had given something to me, even if it was indirectly. And so I joined that board, and it has led to the things that I do, things like CFO Rising, where we're mentoring controllers and VPs of finance who ultimately want to become a CFO and want to figure out what it takes to do that. I just find it fascinating to be able to give back to people and institutions so that generation has an easier time or maybe has a more direct connection to how to maybe get there where they want to get to than maybe I look back and think that I had. I just sort of figure out some things on my own and find my own mentors. And I just love the idea of helping create the next group of people that will help take care of people like me. And I, find that that's just very fulfilling in life.
Absolutely. Well, that's awesome. So, Rich, I wanted to ask, looking back at your career and your path and the journey you've taken, was becoming a CEO always the goal?
No, in fact, it was not the goal. I am a very planning-oriented person. Before my wife and I got married, and before we had graduated college, I had written down my 15-year plan of what I wanted to be when I grew up. And it was mapped year by year, title by title, what job responsibility I wanted to have. And when we graduated college and got married, I focused very hard on executing that plan for 15 years. And then I got to the end of that 15-year plan, and I realized that I no longer had a plan. And so I wrote down the next 15 years and figured out what I wanted to do from there. And that plan was much simpler than the first one because it simply said, rinse and repeat, be a CFO again until you get to the end of the 15 years. And I would tell people very squarely when they asked if I wanted to try to make the transition from CFO to CEO, my answer back was, I'm not really a visionary number one type. I'm really the person who's a great number two. When a CEO sets a vision or a strategy, I have a very great capability of turning that strategy into the tactical actions that it takes to achieve the strategy. That's what I'm good at. And so I said, I'm really positioned well to just continue to be that strong number two to a great leader. And then I looked around about 4 or 5 years ago, and I started to think about that perspective, and my perspective on that changed. And I simply said, you know what, there is a place in the right industry with the right type of company where the combination of a person who can establish a vision but really promote it operationally, that there's a spot for that kind of CEO. And I changed my perspective, and I told my wife, I said, I think I want to be a CFO or a CEO someday. And she said, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It took you a while to get there. I knew that was the case, but now I'm glad you figured it out. And so I said, well, thanks. And she laughed. And so when this opportunity came along, it really was perfectly timed and fitting, because it was right at the time when I was really understanding what I wanted to do next in my career, and kind of maybe even where I wanted to finish off my career over the longer term. So it's been fascinating to see that change, but it was a very strict 180 change in what my career goals were in the last 5 years.
That's impressive. Is there someone or some attribute that you credit your work ethic to and your success?
It goes all the way back to my dad. It then goes to the 6 or 7 mentors I had throughout my career, some very important ones. And lastly, very specifically, I've been very fortunate to work in the last 15 or so years for some really amazing CEOs, 2 in particular, Peter LaMontagne, who he and I worked together at Paradigm Solutions, and then we worked together in the early days of Novetta. And then Tiffany Gates, who I worked with for the second half of Novetta's life cycle before we sold to Accenture. And so it's just been the influences of my dad, those other business mentors as I was younger and establishing my career, all the way up through ultimately looking at how Peter and Tiffany did things similarly from a leadership perspective, but very different in their approach, and incorporating that understanding, their one-liners, that style, and sort of merging it into the type of CEO that I am now, which is a mixture of maybe all of those 9 or 10 people's attributes all mixed into one that I try to accomplish. And so you take all of those component pieces and kind of put them together, but it's been the accumulation of all of those influences over 30 years that I think helped me make the decision, and also influence how I try to operate the company every day as I engage with employees, as I engage with my fellow executives, and as I engage with our owners and our board of director group. And it's just, you look back and reflect, and you can see all the influences over those time periods when I do things that I don't even realize I'm doing it because of those things. So I step back and think about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And Richard, I understand that you lost your parents in 2012, and they were a huge part of your, like you mentioned, your mentorship, your life, and your values. So has this loss changed your perspective at all in the way perhaps you move going forward?
It does. We talked a lot about my dad. My mom was a stay-at-home mom. She stayed home for that entire time, and every day when I came home from school, she was there, right? So it's that huge influence of seeing dad at work, seeing dad when he comes home from work, but mom being there when I came home. I was never the child that had to open the door myself and come home to an empty house, fortunately. And that was very impactful. When my parents passed away in 2012, and they passed away within 2 months of each other at the age of 77. So we lost mom first from a stroke, and dad through complications from a slow-going leukemia. And so it really was a pivot for me. For about the next 10 years, I sunk myself into work. And when I wasn't sinking myself into work, it was into the charities and spending time with my wife and our only child, our daughter, who's now 21 and a junior in college, back in our hometown of Scranton, by the way. So she went back to where my wife and I couldn't wait to get out of. So, but it really was a reflection, I think, is sort of lifelong. When you lose your parents, there's something that's different. I can remember up until 2012, anytime I had an accomplishment in my career, anytime I did something great at home, I called my dad and I told him, because that made it impactful, that he could then be proud of the son that he and my mom raised, that they paid for college, that they helped me into my early career, that they helped my wife and I as we were first married. And then when you no longer have that person to call, you have to find a new person to talk to again. And so although my wife and I had always talked, she took on a new position. And the way I interacted with my daughter after my parents passed away was just different. she became even more of a focus than she might have otherwise already been as an only child, simply because I now had realized that time really was of the essence. You don't think about that when you're younger and the family is still stable, your parents are there, your wife and daughter are there, work is there. You prioritize things differently than when you actually find out firsthand that at some point people are going to pass away and your life is going to change. That puts a new perspective on things that you think you take into account every day. You think you prioritize. And then when those big changes happen, I think at least for me, it changed my perspective even more and caused me to change the way I did certain things in life.
Mm-hmm. I mean, even through our conversation, you've mentioned your family, whether it's your dad or your wife or your mom, throughout all of these questions and topics. So it's evident how important family is to you. So, that comes off very clear.
Oh, thank you. And it is true.
Well, to close, I heard that you're kind of positioned to retire around 55, which is very cool. So what is next for you, whether you choose that path or not? What are you looking forward to in the future?
Right now, honestly, I'm looking forward to continuing, from a work perspective, continue to really focus on SPA and build SPA into the company that we know it can be. And that's a pretty tall order. So I am here as long as I'm needed to continue to help run and drive this company in the direction that it should go and take care of our employees and our customers. But over the long term, ultimately at some point, there will be a transition and I will move on to something else. I joke and say this is the last full-time position I'll have. However long it takes at SPA for me to be here and do what we want to accomplish. I don't really plan to take another full-time job after this, but I have realized that I'm just super energized being here at SPA. And so I can't count out the same way I changed my mind of going from CFO to CEO. There might be another one after this one, or this one might last a lot longer than I think, just because we're having so much fun and we're making so much happen here at the business. That I don't know. But ultimately, the current plan on paper is whenever SPA no longer needs me as CEO, I'd like to continue on in my areas of expertise from a board level or consultative position in a number of different companies to help those companies out or those charities out by being a board member or board of trustee member. And that seems like a great way to keep myself active, but not too active, get some time, more time with my wife and daughter, more time with our extended family, but not lose a complete grip on those things that I've really enjoyed for the last 25 or 30 years in terms of business.
Awesome. I mean, it's great to hear that's the goal, right? When you love what you do so much that you can't really envision it ending so soon. That's awesome. Well, Rich, this has been such a great conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your background with us, your ups and downs, your perspectives, and the different transitions in your life. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's been a lot of fun. Thanks very much.
Like what you hear? Make sure to subscribe to Humble Beginnings on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and get notified when new episodes are released. Thanks for listening.